Hey guys, I'm Yurouzi. This is the part 8 of What If Naruto and Team 7 was actually trained by Kakashi. Kakashi survived his losses in spirit as well as in body, and having learned both wisdom and intellect from his experiences, he now seeks to pass those traits on to his students. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 30, The Final Match. Hinata's Fate. Naruto climbed the last step to his teammates still beaming from his win. The moment he saw their grinning faces, he let out a whoop and raced towards them, getting a return whoop from Sakura and a quiet laugh from Sasuke and Kakashi. He was shocked when Sakura picked him up bodily and gave him a hug. Sure, it was obviously a friend hug, not a friend-friend hug, but it felt good nonetheless, and he returned it cheerfully. When she set him back down, he found Sasuke standing there, fist out. That was a good fight, Dobe, he said, with a degree of sincerity that Naruto had never heard from the Uchiha. He bumped fists with Sasuke, giving him an even wider grin. Thanks, team. Sasuke's eyes sparkled with mirth at the cheerful and insolent insult. Man, what a good day I'm having, he thought. My team kicked butt, we're all heading for the finals, and I nailed Shikamaru so good in a fight. I'll be dreaming about the look on Shika's face when that clone had caught him unawares for months. Naruto turned when he heard the sound of Akamaru barking loudly and looked at the board. His eyes lit up as he saw the names: Inuzuka Kiba and Akimichi Choji. Kiba was already on the floor, grinning and standing in his tough guy pose. The fluffy-edged gray jacket did little to help his tough guy persona. Neither did Akamaru, his little puppy companion, who was flopped over his head like some sort of boneless puppy hat, yipping every few seconds and wagging his tail. Choji did not look nearly as enthused. He had decided to take the stair, and even as he made his way to the center of the arena he continued to munch rapidly on a bag of potato chips. Compared to the muscular and strident Kiba, Choji looked like a chubby, dumpy little boy wearing his dad's oversized clothing, but the way he was eating had an almost rodent-like ferocity to it. Kiba's got this in the bag, said Sakura cheerfully as she leaned over the railing to watch. Behind her, Naruto gave Sasuke a cheesy grin and rubbed his forefinger and thumb together and nodded at Sakura. Sasuke got the message, and while he wasn't sure about the odds, Naruto of all people should be good at spotting long-shot winners. Why not? If you're so sure about that, said Sasuke, leaning over to match Sakura's pose exactly, maybe you want to bet on it? I think Choji might have a chance. Sakura looked at him, eyebrows raised in surprise. What's the terms? Sasuke opened his mouth, then closed it. What the hell could they bet? Neither one of them was swimming in cash, and neither one of them was poor, so money had no special value. And as far as he knew, there was nothing he wanted from her, or her from him. In the end, he shrugged. What terms do you want? She grinned with far too many teeth at that. Ino would kill me if I used that opening to press for a date, and so would you, I think. Sasuke frowned, and she gave him a playful wink. Instead, let's bet on what we both will want soon. Time? Asked Naruto. Sakura nodded. We're all going to be training like crazy until the finals. We'll need all the time we can get. So until the finals, loser does the winner's housework. All the cleaning and shit we have to do to keep our homes operating reasonably. I win, and Sasuke does the household chores I am normally given by my parents. Sasuke wins, and I have to clean his house, or whatever it is he does with his home. Sasuke only needed a moment to think about it, but it seemed like a good deal to him, if he won. He had a small apartment on the edge of the old Uchiha compound, a small thing that served as a place to eat and sleep when not training. He was fairly orderly, but not insanely so. If he won, she'd have some work to do, but not a particularly onerous amount, and he'd have that much more time to practice. If he won. His eyes flickered slightly in Naruto's direction, and the boy shot him a discreet thumbs up. Deal, he said, settling down to watch while Sakura grinned like a bandit. Down on the floor, Hayate had an arm out as he prepared to start the fight. He asked Kiba if the boy was ready, and he gave a lazy stretch. Yeah, I guess if Chubby here is ready to get his ass beat, I'm ready too. Hayate looked at Choji and was about to speak, when he heard the voice of the orange genin, Naruto, calling out from the side. Hey, Choji, he shouted cheerfully, did Kiba just call you fat? A few feet away, Shikamaru ran a hand over his face, partially to hide a grin. He'd been trying to figure out how to gracefully get his friend worked up, but sometimes the most graceless of people can be effective too. Hey looked at Choji, slightly confused, just in time to see the bag of chips explode in the boy's hand as he made a fist. Start the match, he said, his face going red. Hey nodded and lifted his hand. Begin. Kiba was ready to shout back at Naruto for putting words in his mouth, but he was suddenly too busy. Choji inflated into a perfectly spherical shape, his limbs and head hidden within, and began spinning. Kiba had seen this transformation before, but seeing it chasing down an enemy was quite different from seeing it from the front end. Kiba threw himself to the side, allowing Akamaru to jump away as well, and he heard the pavement crunching on the floor as Choji passed. Kiba stood and dusted himself off, watching as Choji made a wide turn and raced back at him. This time, Kiba dodged in a more timely fashion, watching carefully as Choji tried and failed to veer in his direction. Easy win, Kiba thought fearfully. Fine. You wanna play ball? He dropped to all fours, flooding his body with chakra and using it to force his nail to grow into sharp talons. We're good at it. He whistled, and Akamaru jumped over to join him, landing on his back and yipping. Let's do it, Akamaru. Human beast clone. With a puff of smoke, Akamaru turned into an exact copy of Kiba, down to the feral claws on his hands. With matching snarls, both lunged into the attack. Choji chose one to focus on, rolling as fast as he could, but even as he did so, the other hit him from the side, sending the human ball bouncing and tumbling across the arena. One of the Kiba let out a howling laugh, then turned to the other and said, Akamaru, fetch. The other clone nodded and chased after the clone, moving at an incredible speed for a genin, although not as fast as Lee could. He dashed past Choji, then turned and delivered another strike, sending the spinning back to Kiba. For almost a minute, Kiba kept pounding on Choji, knocking him back and forth between them. With each hit, the ball would reorient at them, pushing to gain control, but with each hit, the two Kiba would change position and strike him on the side again. Eventually, the real Kiba noticed that his companion across the way was starting to pant heavily. Akamaru does not have nearly the chakra I do, he thought, and I'd hate to disable him with a soldier pill just to win such an easy match. He waited for Akamaru to kick Choji back, then shouted, let's wrap this up, buddy. Akamaru jumped over to Kiba with a yip, and they both watched Choji finally gain control and roll, with a slightly wobbly path, right at them. Let's go! Shouted Kiba, Fong passing Fong. The two Kiba started spinning at a ferocious rate, forming two powerful whirlwinds of claws and strength. They both hit the rolling Choji dead on, sending all of their kinetic energy into the impact. Choji flew away from them at incredible speed, and Kiba started to crow. Then he hit the arena wall, dead on, and the spinning orb of Choji's body deformed briefly into a spinning ellipse under the pressure of the comparatively immobile object, the spin pulling him up the wall slightly on impact. Doing so angled the resulting crater upward as well, resulting in a very, very short barrel of wall aiming down directly at Kiba. Then the compression forced on Choji's body by the impact, reversed by the impact with the wall, sent him sailing at Kiba at nearly the same speed as he'd left. Most of his spinning inertia had been killed with the wall impact, leaving him as just a large round projectile heavy enough to crush pavement moving at a speed it would not normally be able to move with even the hardest of effort. He hit both Kiba, which, combined, had far less than half the mass of Choji, and almost no inertia at all. Both Kiba received the sudden dose of gifted kinetic energy with the time-honored tradition of accelerating rapidly away. Unfortunately, with their much lower mass, that energy was more than sufficient to send them flying into the opposing wall with a tremendous thud. It was sheer luck that Choji was aimed directly between them, thus hitting at an angle and sending them back at that same angle. It was also sheer luck that their combined masses did not variate Choji's own trajectory significantly. The happy result of this luck was that, despite being in no condition to move, they nonetheless avoided the impact of Choji hitting the wall and coming to a very sudden and very final stop. After a few seconds of silence, Choji pulled himself out of the crater in the wall, his legs wobbling. And up in the stands, Sasuke smirked at Sakura, who was glaring at him with surprising fury for such a small bet. Sucker, he said, eliciting a laugh from Naruto. Up in the stands, only 3 people did not smile or laugh or joke about the fight. All 3 were fully focused on the match announcing board. Neji stared with bored disinterest. Between his own talents, and the techniques Kakashi had taught him, he knew he would be the victor. It was simply impossible for him to fail against the remaining foes. He would win. It was fated. Hinata stared with nervous tension. She knew she was hardly the strongest shinobi there, and she also knew that Niji-san was a possible opponent, and he might possibly be the strongest, although Hinata was beginning to wonder about that after seeing Naruto's team fight. And her other possible opponent was well experienced, even if he had not passed the exam before. Kabuto stared at the board with a mask of anxiety plastered on his face as his mind raced. He had strict orders to follow, as his time in Konohagakure slowly ran to an end. Against Niji, under those constraints, he might end up losing in a fair fight if he limited himself. But how the hell could he possibly make his loss look good against the nervous little girl Hyuga? Finally, the last match popped up, and Niji got an ugly look on his face as he snarled. Tenten looked at him nervously, having only rarely seen him express emotions. She hesitantly reached out and gave him a pat on the back. It's okay, Niji, none of this counts until the finals. He shrugged off her hand with an angry flick. I don't want to get into the finals without a fight, he growled, his voice low. Then his anger faded, to be replaced by a cold, cruel smirk. Still, at least I get the pleasure of watching my cousin fall to the weakest genin I have ever met, besides her. Last match, said Hayate, coughing into a balled fist. Hyuga Hinata, Kabuto, please come down. When Hinata saw the board light up with her name, she was almost ready to faint. She had been quite close as it was when she realized she might face Niji on the arena floor, and the relief of not having that task before her kept her moving, even as she advanced down the aisle to take the stairs. She saw Naruto ahead, talking rapidly with Sakura-san and Kakashi-sensei. Her heart pounded in her chest, her ears filled with the sound of her own blood rushing, and she did her best to keep moving forward and ignore everything but her next footstep. Then Naruto saw her approaching and turned to face her fully, with a big cheerful grin on his face. She froze, terrified, as a single horrifying thought landed in her mind and flashed behind her eyes. I am going to lose in front of Naruto-kun, and he'll never respect me. She bit back the tears that threatened to escape and gave him a timid, shaky smile. He stepped forward and held out a fist. You kicked my ass so many times during training. I'm sure you're gonna kick his ass just as hard. If you have to, pretend he's one of my clones, and smack him around. You can do it, Hinata. He still stood there, a little awkwardly, fist out and waiting for her to return the gesture. Sakura leaned in and whispered something in Naruto's ear, and he suddenly brightened. Hey, good idea, Sakura-chan. Hinata, fight as hard as you can, and when it's over, we'll go get some ramen, my treat. Win or lose, just do your best. A date with Naruto. For just a moment, her eyes lit up slightly, then dimmed again. He wouldn't call it a date. Just him and the loser, hanging about. She nodded timidly to acknowledge his offer and moved to pass by Team 7. Naruto turned to follow her, slightly confused, his fist slowly dropping unacknowledged. Kakashi leaned down and whispered in Naruto's ear, and in his rush to give his apparently bummed friend a boost, Naruto didn't even stop to think as he repeated, win, and we'll call it a date. Wait, what? Naruto turned to glare at Kakashi, who nodded in Hinata's direction. Naruto turned and realized that Hinata had stopped moving completely, not even breathing. He looked at Kakashi again, and the man gave another nod in her direction while giving him what could only be called a death glare. Naruto was confused, so he shrugged to himself and followed Kakashi's lead. He'd done right by his sensei before, after all. Yeah, he said, trying his best to sound cheerful in spite of his confusion. Yeah, we'll call it a date. So go kick his ass, Hinata-chan. After a moment, without any sort of acknowledgement, she started to move again, her steps even more shaky. Naruto turned to Kakashi and quietly whispered, Are you sure about this, Kakashi? She looks even more demoralized now. Kakashi smirked under his mask and gave his cute, stupid little genin a pat on the head. Trust me. Kabuto watched his foe approach and suppressed a sigh. The timid little thing was walking out, head down and index fingers pressing rapidly against one another. Cute and all, but it does me no good if she passes out with a single blow. His mind raced as he considered his options. He did have a few medicinal preparations he could try, but most of them would have harmful side effects, either physical or mental, and he was not supposed to cripple anyone here. Are you ready? Asked Hayate. Kabuto gave a distracted nod. Hayate glanced at the girl, who gave a tiny nod. Begin. And Kabuto suddenly felt much more enthused about his problem, because his opponent ran to get at him. He knew a lot about the famed Juken martial arts practiced by the Hyuga. With a single touch, a proper Juken strike could close down a chakra coil completely for a long period of time. Without chakra, most shinobi were unable to operate at all, never mind in combat. Juken could also be used to directly attack the organs in the target, bypassing skin and bone to directly slice into the chakra that infused the organs of every living thing, which could easily destroy those organs. Both of these were good cause for concern, now that his foe seemed motivated. The girl lashed out at him viciously, bringing her arms around in long arcs and attacking him from various directions, trying to hit with even the lightest tap. He spun and dodged where he could, and where he could not, he deflected her hands carefully, making certain not to let her fingertips touch him. Juken was difficult to defend against for that very reason, and Kabuto found himself hard-pressed to avoid every attack. Then he raised his arm to deflect another strike, only for the girl to abandon the initial attack and drop to the floor, scything her leg at his own. What the hell, he thought, that's not a Juken move. Kabuto jumped, easily avoiding the slightly awkward leg sweep, and felt like slapping himself in the face when the girl remained close to the ground and started trying to tap his legs while he was still in the air. With no ability to deflect or dodge in the middle of his jump, he did the only thing he could do and started shifting his legs randomly before each tap. She got in 6 fluid, rapid taps before he hit the ground. When he landed, he threw himself away from her as hard as he could, rolling into a crouch well out of her reach and hissing in pain. He had managed to prevent her from striking his chakra coils, which would have taken his legs out completely, but halfway through her attack, she had noticed his defense and switched to the less precise organ-damaging blows. They were not terribly effective on muscle tissue, but they did have an effect, and his legs burned horribly as he stood up from his crouch. He saw her, panting hard but arms up and ready, and favored her with a smile. "I guess I'll have to take you seriously, Hyuga-san," he said cheerfully. A blue glow began to infuse his hands as he formed his chakra scalpels. They weren't nearly as precise as the Juken, but they could cut flesh and bone, and would allow him to make the fight look less one-sided for the observers. This time he pressed the attack, charging forward with a much more direct and graceless style, barely any better than the academy form for little kids. She tried to parry his first attack, then swiftly pulled her arm back when he flexed his fingers and tried to tap her arm. After that near miss, she started fully evading instead, twisting and turning with every blow he tried to strike. In this, her tiny little girl body aided her immensely, as did her own natural agility. But no defense is perfect, and Kabuto finally spotted an opening. He lunged, plunging his fingers from above into her shoulder. He could have simply cut the muscles without any outward sign of injury, but he wanted to make an impression, so he cut through the skin as well. His fingers went deep, breaking her clavicle and almost severing her supraspinatus. Then his hand stopped, both by the remains of her broken shoulder, and by the small hand wrapped around his wrist. The girl looked up at him, even as she grimaced in pain and clamped down harder on his arm, using the leverage of her grip to push his hand hard against her injury to trap it. Then she smiled, and quietly said, "You are in range of my divination." Kabuto fought back a smile of his own. Perfect. Then pain happened. The 8 trigram 64 palms maneuver, a core technique of the main branch Juken of the Hyuga family, was designed to knock an opponent back, keeping them off balance as the Juken user systematically closed the major chakra coils of their opponent. Unfortunately, the technique also required 2 hands and an opponent that is not being held in place. Hinata could never complete the entire form as she and her foe were positioned, so she settled for shutting down only the half of Kabuto's body she could easily reach instead. She released his hand with the final blow, shoving him back as hard as she could. Normally, between his greater mass and her own high agility, low strength build, it would have done little, but with Kabuto's entire left side immobilized, he stumbled and fell into a graceless roll. Then the elation she felt over her seeming success fell apart as her shoulder screamed in pain. She grabbed her arm and sank to the floor, fighting the urge to scream. She heard her opponent start to chuckle and lifted her head enough to see that he was managing to pull himself up carefully. "You got me good," he said, taking a single wobbling step before slumping to the ground. With a grunt, he began the process again. "But I lost one side, and you lost the other." He fell over again, and started to crawl slowly towards her. "In a trade of 1 for 1, I think I'll win. I'm more used to the pain, little girl." Hinata's eyes started to water, and she leaned over, holding her throbbing arm. It seared with a sort of icy heat, a pain so extreme it passed through pain itself and became something more, some non-pain that hurt more in her heart than her body. She slumped to the ground, then struggled to sit back up against the overwhelming suffering. He's half down and crawling, Hinata-chan. Finish him off. She could hear Naruto shouting at her, although it felt like he was across a vast canyon from her, distant and invisible. But still watching. He's watching. She rolled onto her back with a pained grunt. He's cheering. She sat up, sending new shards of non-pain through her shoulder as her back muscles pulled at it. He wants me to win. She wedged one foot under herself and leaning forward, managed to get into a crouch, then straightened. Across from her, Kabuto was also crouched, his one arm dangling, the other arm sheathed in blue. He was smiling, but sweat was dripping down his face. All I have to do is cripple your other arm, and I'll win. If it comes to it, I have the strength to kick you unconscious with one leg alone. Hinata took a deep breath and prepared herself. It'll be worth it, she told herself. She then moved back into her normal stance, with one arm hanging limp. That would be true, she panted through the pain. But I still have two arms. She reached over with her good arm and pulled the damaged one up until her undamaged muscles elsewhere in her shoulder could take over the movement. The agony made light flash in front of her eyes. Her shoulder became a ball of suffering as her broken bones were ground together, and as the last of her supraspinatus snapped. But slowly, surely, her arm rose, even if it did tremble as it did so. The movement is limited, she thought to herself as she grit her teeth to keep herself from yelling, because if my arm goes too down or back, I will need to lift it with the other arm again. The only advantage she had in this case was that she could still channel chakra, and thus, a touch from her damaged arm could still hurt her foe. Kabuto looked up at her, panting, his face disbelieving. Then he smiled, and Hinata felt for a moment that smile was a little too cheerful for someone in his condition. He let his dead leg sag and rolled onto his back. I give up. She obviously wants the win more than I do right now, thank you. He let out a bitter laugh that sounded a little forced to Hinata, then a cough. Maybe next year. Hinata managed to hear Naruto's whoop before she fell to the ground. There will be a 1-month break, said Hayate, as those who had passed and were able to move stood before him, between here and the final round. In this time, you will have an opportunity to heal and train to prepare yourself. Your matches will be decided now, before you leave. The board behind them began to flicker as it displayed the matches. Sakura and Tenten grinned at each other as their names showed up. Sasuke smirked at Kankuro, who gave him a stiff nod. Gaara did not react, which did little to calm Misumi's nerves. Naruto gave a thumbs up to Choji, who smiled back. And Niji smiled grimly when Hinata's name showed next to his own. I can't wait to see you all next month, said the Hokage. You're dismissed. As soon as he got home, Niji went to his room and laid down in his bed. While he had not needed to fight in the preliminaries, the week before had been long and uncomfortable, and all he wanted was some rest. It was for that reason that he was deeply unamused when Hatake Kakashi opened his window and climbed in. You shouldn't walk in uninvited, Niji said without preamble. Especially not into a clan's holding. Does anyone even know you are here? Kakashi waved off Niji's objection as if it was irrelevant. Your cousin will be in the hospital for a few days while the medics heal the broken bone, he said. Good, said Niji, without inflection. Your uncle is there too, of course. Good, Niji repeated, although this time he could not stop a little rancor from coloring his tone. Maybe you should talk to them. Maybe you should go read your book. Niji turned away from the window. He heard Kakashi sigh, then a rustle of cloth as he slipped into the room and quietly took a seat at Niji's writing desk. I meant somewhere else, he grumbled. He looked at Kakashi, who was sitting in the chair, slumped over to get his face near Niji's. Niji, recall for me the options we discussed regarding your clipped wings. He said this in a near whisper. Niji sighed and closed his eyes, trying to remember their quiet conversations when Kakashi was training him. Assassinate the Seal Masters. Assassinate the clan head. Foment rebellion. Petition Hokage for manumission and see if Jiraiya can help. Challenge Hayashi to a battle for my freedom. Hold the clan head and his heirs hostage. And you're missing none from the list? None of the options we discussed? Niji frowned, and re-examined the list in his head. After a moment, he grunted a negative. This is why you will never succeed. Niji sat up quickly and glared at Kakashi, who stared back at him with the same mask of apathy he gave everyone. That apathy did nothing to calm Niji. If anything, it inflamed him. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "tell me, oh wise one, what did I miss?" Kakashi shrugged. "Political support." Niji rolled his eyes. "Really? You act like the main branch loves having you under the yoke. You treat them like they are a nameless mass, just one big foe to wrestle with and defeat. You treat them like faceless peons. Just like you feel they treat you. Surely you see the irony in that thought." Niji crossed his arms and only glared harder. Kakashi shrugged, then smoothly stood up and made for the window. "If I were you," he said as he stuck one leg out, "I would go talk to them and figure out how they feel. It might very well be that they're on your side, in which case you gain allies. And if not, well, you'll know to plan around them instead." Kakashi jumped away, leaving Niji glowering at his empty room. "Niji-san? Why are you here?" Niji walked over to one of the chairs next to Hinata's bed and sat, glaring down at her, if only to keep from glaring at her father, his uncle, the one who ordered his father's death. He took a deep breath, and let his face settle into a stern look. "You are aware we are matched against one another in the finals?" Hinata nodded. "I want to know if you will use my seal against me when I crush you." He stared hard at Hinata, watching her face carefully. He expected a sudden hot denial from her, or a sheepish stuttering mess that told him nothing. He did not expect her to look him in the eye and say no, with a touch of horror in her voice. He activated his Byakugan to focus that much harder on her. "Why not?" he said in the same imperious tone. "It would be wrong. Wrong to win in such a low way." Hinata shook her head, and a tear rolled down her face. Wrong to use it at all." Hayashi looked at Niji, his face as carefully schooled as always. "Why do you believe this of us, Niji? Why do you think we are seeking an excuse to use the caged bird seal against you?" Niji could not keep the bitterness from his voice, nor the hate from his face, as he turned to Hayashi. "You've done it before," he said. Hayashi sighed and hung his head, and for a moment, his mask of Hyuga decorum and calm fell. Niji expected an angry, bitter face, but all he saw was a tired old man. "Niji," he said heavily, "I understand your burden. I understand your anger. Yes, I did use the cursed seal on you. Once. As was required by me. This does not mean I enjoy it. It does not mean I want it. I am forced by my place to follow the traditions of our clan, regardless of my own desires." He frowned and looked at Niji, and the boy was struck by the weight behind his uncle's gaze. "In your words, it is my fate, and one that is not particularly kind, I think." "Don't speak to me about fate," said Niji coldly. "Those fated to live through the murder of another have no right to speak of fate as if it is something to be suffered." Hayashi sighed deeply. "This is about your father, is it not, Niji? Always. I will never forget." Hayashi reached into his robe and pulled out a small scroll. The scroll was old and worn, the edges run ragged by constant handling. Hayashi looked down at it, his hands clenching it tight. "I don't know why, but I was never able to give this to you. Even now, a part of me wants me to hold on to it still. It's the last testament of my brother, the last thing he did before he died, and I never wanted to let it go." He smiled at the scroll, a grim little smile. "In a way, my own greed for his last words may have cost his son his future." Hayashi stood and placed the scroll on Hinata's bed, then turned his chair to face them both as Niji started to read it. The boy's face flickered as he did so, his eyes barely moving, his face twitching as he struggled between bewilderment, anger, and sadness. Finally, he set down the scroll and turned to his uncle, with a strange light in his eye. "Tell me the story," he said simply. Niji stood, his mind jumbled. He looked at Hayashi, kneeling with his head pressed to the floor, begging forgiveness for something he wasn't even responsible for. He gave his uncle a short bow, at a loss as to what else to do, and began to walk towards the door. "Wait, Niji-san." Niji stopped and turned to look at Hinata. Her eyes were red, and her hospital gown was dotted with her tears. Niji felt touched that she cared enough to cry when even he could not. "The cursed seal ends with me," she said, quietly but firmly, her fingers wadding up her blanket. "I cannot, and will not, abide by it. I will not have my sister branded for no reason but that she is younger than me. I will not have your children branded because of the misfortune of their birth. And I will not have anyone branded with the excuse of sealing away their Byakugan in death while main house members operate freely as shinobi, exposed to the same dangers and yet expected to somehow be immune to misfortune. She said all this in an even tone, as if her words were to be engraved and posted in great metal sheets over every home in the clan, and Niji was astounded that his weak, stuttering cousin could even manage the words, never mind the tone of certainty. She turned to her father, who had lifted his head, but remained kneeling. I must train for the finals, she said, her voice a careful monotone, as if reading from a script. We know I have not succeeded in the past under your guidance. I shall need a new teacher. One that is strong, and has proven their worth. She spared a glance at Niji, as did Hayashi. Unfortunately, my trainer must know enough to train me. So he, too, must be trained. Hayashi looked thoughtful for a moment, his eyes unfocused, then he gave a short, thin smile and stood. His own voice took the same singular tone as he said, not knowing who you may choose to teach you, I nonetheless feel that it is wise to accept any choice you make on those terms, to ensure your continued growth and safety as heir. I make an oath that I shall train someone who is strong enough to then teach you, when you find them. Have you found such a teacher yet? Hyuga Niji, son of Hyuga Hizashi. I am shocked and appalled. Hayashi's voice did not change from his monotone, but his eyes crinkled slightly as he held back a smile. However, as a man of my word, I cannot refuse an oath. He turned to Niji and gave a short bow. Hyuga Niji, you have been appointed my daughter's personal trainer. To ensure the success of your duties, I will be personally training you in the main branch form of the Jukin. Report tomorrow at dawn to begin your future duties. Niji narrowed his eyes. Can you even do this? He asked skeptically. Do what? Asked Hisashi in the same dull tone. I have made an oath before 3 witnesses. I would never abandon my honor or oath, as all Hyuga know. My daughter is obviously much smarter than I give her credit for, shame on me for letting her fool me. Still, at least she has a good grasp of political bargaining. 3. Niji turned and did a very undignified jump when he saw Kakashi sitting on a chair in the corner, face still in his book. Yo, he said casually in greeting, before flipping a page and giggling. This will change nothing, said Niji with a frown. This will change everything, said Hayashi, standing from the floor, returning to his normal voice. In my time there was never a powerful example of the equal strength of the branch house to show the elders. Already, others think of you as a prodigy, in both houses. In due time, with your example as a visual aid for those who might oppose her, Hinata may very well be able to change our people. He gave a short bow to Niji, a formal one, and then rose. Will you accept this new duty, Niji, son of Hizashi? Niji paused to look at Hinata, who was beaming at him, then to Kakashi, who gave him a thumbs up without looking. Finally, he turned and gave a short bow to Hayashi, lower than the one he had been given, as befit his status. Yes, Hayashi-sensei. Chapter 31, The Teachers Arrive. Train us. Naruto did not walk out of the forest of death and into Konoha proper with his team. He strutted, head held high. From time to time, he paused to flex at the occasional passing shinobi, and much to his surprise and amusement, several of them laughed and returned the pose, or just gave him a high five. He still got the occasional glare from civilian passerby, and more than a few of those who did not cheer him on looked at him like he was mad, but it was worth it. Sakura made no effort to pretend the situation wasn't funny. She laughed along, and more than a few times, those who chose to flex back at Naruto would turn to her and do the same, which she returned with a cheerful smile and good graces. Many of the passing shinobi, those not drawn into Naruto's antics, gave her a respectful nod as they passed by, or a thumbs up. Shinobi gossiped like an old wives' club when matters were not classified, and Sakura was delighted to find out from one of them that the tape of her match was already starting to spread. She was even more delighted when she heard that Iruka was planning on showing his copy to every graduating class as an example of seeing underneath the underneath. Sasuke smiled easily during this walk. He did not need the approval or support of passerby, but he also did not feel the urge to take that goodwill from his teammates. The dead last and one of the most useless fangirls from the academy had both made it into the finals, right alongside of him, and he felt more than a little pride in their shared accomplishment. The respectful nods he got from the more serious shinobi and civilians were certainly pleasant enough. Naruto was leading them all in a completely unsubtle manner towards Ichiraka Ramen, already thinking about his upcoming month of training, and ramen, when he heard a whistle behind him. He and the others turned to look at Kakashi, standing behind them with a cheerful and yet solemn air. You three have done incredibly during this exam, he said, his one eye looking at each of them in turn. The last time 3 rookie genin from the same squad made it to the finals of their first exam was though when the Sannin took their test. In the end, all 3 were promoted, and at this rate, I suspect you 3 will be too, and this time without a war to justify it. To know I even had a part in such a group is humbling. You had a big part in it, Kakashi-sensei, said Sakura, beaming. Without Kakashi's efforts in training them with other genin, who knows what sort of kunoichi she would have become. She had needed the kick in the pants she got from tussling with Kiba, and she doubted she would have gotten it from her teammates. She would have cheered Sasuke on as he crushed her, and rejected Naruto every time he tried to help, she was sure. She idly reached up to her shoulder to scratch at Kiri's chest and thanked whatever guided their lives that things had worked out the way they had. Without you, this team would not be as strong, and neither would I, said Sasuke with a slightly brittle smile. Each day was a painful reminder for Sasuke, not of what he needed to do, but what he'd almost done. Before his team, his friends, he was always alone, even in a crowd of fellow students. He had been so focused, so dedicated to his revenge, that he had no thoughts to spare beyond it. Kakashi had caused him to consider the possibility that he was making a mistake in trying to remain alone against the world. He had also made Sasuke think about what might happen after he killed his brother. If Sasuke had stayed on his lonesome course, he might have gotten his revenge, and returned to an empty home to live an empty life, if he didn't decided that his task was over and seek to join his family. Now he'd have his revenge in due time, and when it was over, he would live. The Uchiha would return someday. Yeah, reading that pervy book while we trained must have been hard, said Naruto, who grinned until Sakura gave him a smack in the back of the head. He rubbed his neck sheepishly and gave a more restrained smile. Really, Kakashi-sensei, you helped a lot. Kakashi had changed his life. The blonde was the first to admit he was not as smart as many of his classmates, including Sakura, and maybe, on a generous day, maybe even Sasuke. Kakashi hadn't accepted that from him. Kakashi had poked, and prodded, and encouraged, anything it took to find what worked, and when he found someone who could make Naruto stronger, he sent Naruto off to train without hesitation, even if it was his youthful rival. Kakashi could have let Naruto coast along like most of his academy teachers had, but instead he taught, and when Naruto didn't get it, he tried a different angle, until eventually, even Naruto understood. Kakashi gave a giggle and rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Ma, you're too kind, you 3. Too bad I'm not training you this month. He froze under the sudden glares from his students, and raised his hands defensively. It wouldn't be fair to you 3 if I trained all of you a third of the time, or one of you the entire time. He backed up as the 3 started advancing towards with a slow and menacing strength to their step. Even Naruto had stopped focusing on his next meal and was cracking his knuckles. Besides, he said, trying to sound as cheerful as possible, all 3 of you have had volunteers to train you for the finals. That drew a pause, and the 3 genin stopped advancing and settled for staring at him. I had 3 people approach me, separately, in the time it took for me to get here. All 3 offered to train one of you, and all 3 were good matches for the one they asked for. I didn't want to play favorites, so I figured I'd let you train with someone more suited to your individual strengths. They should be coming to get you sometime in the next day or so try not to wander too far off the beaten path, okay? When they nodded in acknowledgement, he gave them each a pat on the head, even going through the trouble of actually landing that pat on Sasuke's head as the boy dodged, then vanished with a swirl of leaves and smoke. Right, said Naruto, draping an arm across Sakura's shoulders, then removing it when she cracked her knuckles. How about some ramen? We'll probably be super busy, so we won't get to meet up much. Sasuke and Sakura both shrugged and grumbled. Ichiraka ramen was good, but not all day every day good for them. Naruto grinned and pulled out his small frog-shaped wallet. He popped open its clasped mouth and wiggled it back and forth as if it was talking. How about I pay for it, he said in a high falsetto, I've become so fat from all the money I've been able to save. Help me lose some weight? Sakura chuckled, but Sasuke happened to glance into the frog wallet's mouth. His eyes widened, and he took a step back. Tell me that thing's not filled with explosive notes, he said in horror. Not full of them. Just some extras. I saw the roll, Naruto. Naruto laughed, although the laugh had a brittle edge to it. Hey, you saw my fight in the arena, right? Who on earth keeps all of their surprises in one easy-to-steal scroll? He looked down at the wallet, and his smile took on a frightful intensity. Sakura gave Sasuke a light punch on the arm. "Come on," she said, "I'm sure he knows how to not set off an explosive tag. Let's get a meal together." Sasuke have a deep sigh, then stopped and looked up the road a little. When he didn't speak, his teammates turned and looked as well. "I think I'll have to pass on that, Sakura, Naruto. My trainer just showed up." Standing just a few feet away was a man, standing with his arms crossed. He wore a dark gray bodysuit with a high collar, covered with a long hooded jacket in a brilliant white. A large gourd was strapped to his back, but he carried it without the slightest hunch, just as Gaara had. A pair of sunglasses, pressed close to his face, concealed his eyes and gave him an ominous appearance. Aburame Shibi, Shino's father and the pride of the Aburame clan, nodded once to Sasuke and turned to walk away. Sasuke waved to his teammates, then followed, lengthening his strides to catch up to the taller man. Naruto turned to Sakura, hoping to turn their team meal into a date, but Kiri suddenly gave a loud meow and butted heads with Sakura, who frowned. "Damn," she said, rubbing Kiri's head hurriedly, "I forgot, I tossed Kiri's food before the test, in case it went bad. I need to stop by Dan's place and restock." She noticed Naruto's look of defeat and gave him a smile. "Maybe we can meet up the day before, for a completely not a date meal?" Naruto moped a little, but eventually, like the sun coming out from behind the clouds, his grin returned. Yeah, not a date. This time." Sakura swatted him gently, then waved as she ran up the nearest wall to cross the town. Naruto waved goodbye in return, and with at least some good cheer still remaining, he turned and entered the Ichiraka ramen stand. Tsuchi and Ayam were behind the counter, but for once, their faces did not light up on Naruto's arrival. They were both far too focused on their other guest, Tsuchi with anger and Ayam with disgust. Their only other customer was tall man, well into the middle of his life, with a thick and unkempt mane of snow-white hair flowing down almost to the floor. The man wore a Konoha forehead protector, but it was oddly built, with a much wider band of metal and two miniature horns pointing out of it. His otherwise sensible dull green clothing was hampered by the long red vest he wore over it. He looked like a joke shinobi, and like many real shinobi, Naruto did not care to be represented as a joke. The worst part, though, was the leer on the man's face. He was looking at Ayam like Naruto looked at ramen, and some inner core of Naruto rebelled at the idea of looking at his big sister figure in such a way. "So," the man said, leaning forward and resting his head in both of his hands in a manner that was both casual-looking and forced, "how does that sound? I could even get a part for you in my next book. A starring role, even." His eyebrows did a little dance, and when the old man began to make a kissing face, Naruto finally snapped. He put on a cheerful grin and walked up. "Excuse me, mister. Can you help me with something?" The man looked down at Naruto, and there was a slight moment, a flash of something Naruto could not identify, before the old man's face fell into a contemptible sneer. "Go away, kid, you're messing up my patter," he mumbled. Naruto held up his frog wallet. "Can you look at Gamachan for me? His insides are broke, and maybe you can fix them. Please?" Naruto mentally gagged to himself as he said the last in a childish lisp, but his grin never faltered. He saw the same something pass through the man's visage, as if he was trying to hold down some sort of reflexive reaction, before he sighed and took the wallet. "I'm great with kids, you know," he said, pausing to leer at Ayam again. He then popped open Gamachan's mouth. He chuckled a little at the wad of bills in it as he hefted it in his hand a few times. There was a lot of money in there, months of saving after Kakashi had helped Naruto with his money problems, and a few other surprises as well. Naruto knew the exact moment when the old man spotted the roll of explosive tags. His chuckle froze, and his eyes flicked up to Naruto, who had placed his hands in the snake seal as soon as the old man looked at Ayam. "Can't blow up my ramen stand, but he doesn't know that," thought Naruto smugly. "Let's see you handle that." Then the old man grinned. Naruto looked up at the small, Gamachan-sized hole in the ceiling, his mouth agape. A few random bills could be seen floating on a breeze, following the arc his wallet had made as it sailed into the sunset. "Ah, that had my rent in it," he said with a disgusted sigh. He turned to the old man, who was looking at the hole with a smile of amusement and satisfaction across his face. "Wow," he said with an easy smile, "that thing must have been heavy, to fly that far. I think it cleared the village walls." Naruto let out a frustrated grumble and ran a hand through his hair. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice slightly petulant. "You, who are pissing off my favorite people. You who threw my wallet out of the city." He moaned and thumped his head on the countertop. "And why are you dressed like a joke shinobi?" "Joke?" Naruto looked up from the counter to see the odd old man crouching on one of the stools, looking for all the world like a giant, ugly toad. "Joke?" The man stood up on the bar stool, one foot on the stool, one on the bar itself, where he took a dramatic pose, carefully ignoring Toochie's efforts to smash his foot with a small wooden mallet. "Do you not know who you are talking to, kid?" Naruto shook his head. The old man began to hop on the one leg on the bar stool, his other leg raised for balance, one arm thrust forward dramatically. As he did this, the stool slowly began to rotate, spinning him in a slow circle as he did his dance. "Open your eyes and get an eyeful. From north to east, from south to west. Women want me, men want to be me, and everyone fears me. For I am Jiraiya the great toad hermit." The spinning bar stool stopped as Jiraiya came around to face Naruto, a wild and cheerful grin on his face. Then Ayame hit him with the biggest frying pan she had been able to find. Sasuke stopped when they reached the central pillar in the Aburame clan compound. They had stopped by the shared project room in the central hall, where Shino had wordlessly joined them. Sasuke had removed his usual equipment when instructed, storing it in one of the lockers he and Shino had installed to keep the more dangerous materials safely. The two Aburame had then nodded to him and immediately walked out of the room to the central pillar, where Sasuke stopped. "I am not permitted," Sasuke said, giving a polite bow. The Aburame had been quite clear on the matter in the past, and Sasuke had no desire to aggravate his trainer before they even begun. Shibi returned the bow. "You are permitted to enter, with escort." "Why?" "Because the best way to train you is within our family hive, and we would not train you if we thought you were unworthy." He straightened, and without another word, he and Shino both entered the enclosed stairwell. Without hesitation, Sasuke entered. The stairwell wound down, spiraling around the outer wall of the shaft and leaving a large empty space in the center. There was little light, and as they started to walk into the depths, Sasuke saw Shino and his father pocket their sunglasses. The stairs were rock slabs, individually built out of the walls, and each one was remarkably thin. He looked upward, and saw that those stairs continued up past the entrance, all the way up until the very top, which had some oddly patterned stonework supported by several thick stone supports. It took a few moments, but Sasuke eventually recognized the pattern as that of the central square of the miniature village above. The entire square. Sasuke immediately realized the intent of the structure and approved. Living underground, immediate access to the surface in an emergency might be a problem. They had built a large central shaft, then capped it with a plug of stone that could be collapsed with little effort. The thin stairs would snap easily under the weight of the falling stone, creating a wide and clear corridor to the surface that any shinobi could climb. In a real emergency, if they needed all hands to the surface, blowing that cap down would surprise any foes, during which the Aburame and their insects could swarm out and envelope them. Impressive. Practical. Very Aburame. The stairs ended well before the shaft did, at a hole dug into the stone and wide enough for several people to stand. The hole was roughly dug, but had been worn smooth by the passage of time and people. Two Aburame stood at attention just inside the hole, and when Sasuke approached, he could hear their internal hives humming in agitation. But the guard simply nodded to him, and he continued to follow his guides. It took some time to get used to how the Aburame built their home system, carved as it was out of the surrounding rock. Aside from places where gravity was required, there seemed to be no adherence to it. Passages would split up or down as often as side to side, and those who he saw stood at whatever orientation they happened to come out at. Several times, he saw a few clan members pause and talk, both craning their heads up to see the other person. Sasuke wondered how younger children handled traversing their homes, until he saw a pack of them scurrying by using small handholds carved into the walls and ceilings and floors. A few shops and stores were found at this level, almost exclusively catering to shinobi needs, but for the most part, every doorway and window he saw, regardless of orientation, looked into a home of some sort. Those that were not level seemed to curve on the inside until they were, but some rooms even had furniture set up to hold occupants against gravity. In one particular case, he had walked over a window and looked down to see an older female laying in a reclining chair, carefully bolted to the floor by its back so she could sit without using chakra. She had waved at him in a friendly enough manner, and caught off guard, he waved back before moving on. Eventually, they reached the end of their trip, arriving at a very elaborate and hefty metal door. It had several clear windows built into it, and through it, he could see another identical door on the other side, beyond which was bright light and several Aburame working at desks on paperwork. Shibi nodded to one side, to a less elaborate door, and Sasuke entered to find a round table with half a dozen chairs within. Shibi and Shino waved at a chair, and Sasuke sat. To his surprise, they both started to remove their coats, something he had never seen before. In the dim light, he could make out very little, but he could clearly see the small holes in their arms where their insects could enter and leave their bodies. They sat, and while neither one smiled, both looked oddly at ease, even with the unaccustomed loss of their jackets. "All you have seen here is a clan secret," said Shibi without preamble or small talk, in a monotone almost identical to Shino's. "While these secrets are neither dangerous nor deeply important, we, the Aburame clan, ask that you keep them to yourself. Nobody, not even the Hokage, has the right to demand this knowledge from you." Sasuke nodded without hesitation. Without any idea what was within this hive-like structure, any invader would find it almost impossible to work effectively when they made their move, and would be ripe for ambush. Giving away anything on the way this place was built could very well compromise that advantage. Shibi nodded back. "We, the Aburame clan, have had a meeting to discuss this possibility. It was agreed, in mere hours, to offer it to you." "Why?" "Because you are almost singular amongst Konoha shinobi in your respect and understanding of our allies, and we have a need for your assistance. This will be exchanged for training and acceptance as an honorary member of the Aburame hive, if you agree." "What do you need, Aburame-sama?" asked Sasuke. Shino was the one to speak next, leaning forward slightly as he did so. "We host our Kakashi in our bodies, almost from birth. Our hives grow with us, just as any other part of us. This is excellent for our clan jutsu, but it also has a penalty, in that almost all Aburame have a hive. This means that we have few people without a hive with which to test the results of our breeding experiments. Generally, we only get people who marry into the clan, or willingly join for other reasons, and both such are quite uncommon for our unconventional hive. Inserting a new hive into a host with an old one can be dangerous. Between interbreeding and possible biological incompatibility, the old hive can easily become corrupted or destroyed, which has a disastrous effect on a full-fledged Aburame." Shino frowned slightly. "It would be like losing your eyes, the complete removal of a sense that you have lived with all your life, and now had to do without. Thus, we are careful in our efforts. That is why we had those elaborate airlocks leading beyond this point. Those are only to the report desks. Further in, far more complex systems are used to keep the various hives separate and safe, just in case." Sasuke found himself both put off by the Aburame sense of logic and straight talk and feeling grateful for it. Normally, one did not pose a direct question to another in any but the most informal setting out of concern for being seen as rude. The Aburame had no such qualms. "You wish me to take on a hive?" Sasuke asked. Both Shibi and Shino nodded, and Shibi spoke. "We have developed a promising strain of Kakashi, one that may prove to be a great benefit to our clan in the future. But before we risk a child, it would be best to test it on someone who can communicate fully." "Why?" "If a child cannot express themselves, they cannot warn us if something is wrong with their hive or them." Sasuke sat back and thought. The idea made a great deal of sense, viewed through the lens of cold Aburame logic. Choose a willing host who will not have compatibility issues, implant the new strain of Kakashi, and see what happens. The idea of insects crawling through his body was creepy as hell, but that's what people always said about the Aburame themselves, without ever getting to know them. "What does it feel like, Shino? To have a hive within you?" Shino blinked, and Sasuke realized that his friend had never expected a question like that from Sasuke. After a moment, Shino smiled tentatively. "It feels like a friend running a finger down your arm in greeting, only done many, many times at once, at all times. It is a constant reminder that the hive lives, as do you, and with the hive, you are never truly alone." It was Sasuke's turn to blink. He had expected a cold, clinical description of the sensation, and instead had gotten as close to sappy as he had ever seen from his friend. He took a deep breath and thought carefully about the situation, considering what else he would need to know. The Aburame would likely not fault him for thinking carefully on the offer, and would probably not feel insulted if her refused, all the more so for logical reasons. Sasuke had time to think, and he knew it. For almost 5 minutes, he mentally catalogued everything he thought he might need to know, while Shino and Shibi both waited patiently and silently. Finally, he started to ask questions. What are the risk factors? Less than 2% probability of long-term bodily harm, and less than 0.1% of deadly risk, said Shibi. We will teach you how to locate and neutralize the queen of your hive should you ever feel in danger. The process of receiving your queen and the creation of your Kakashi paths is unpleasant, but not permanently harmful it itself. This species is not significantly different from the previous one, only more robust and efficient in its use of chakra from the host. At this point, we are 98% certain the species is safe to use, but we Aburame prefer to get as close to 100% as feasible. And the benefits? Shino looked at his father, then at Sasuke. That depends on you. Kakashi feed on chakra. They are also symbiotic, and will not take more from you than you offer. The more you offer, the faster and stronger the hive grows, and the further it will spread throughout your body. Initially, your hive will be limited. You will be able to drain small amounts of chakra from foes, and plant tracking bugs on them, but many of the more combative techniques of the clan may not be available to you for some time, depending on how much you permit the hive to grow. You mentioned honorary clan membership. Does this require me to renounce my clan, join your clan, or otherwise limit my freedom of choice when it comes to family matters? No, said Shibi. We would welcome you into our clan, if you desired, but Shino has strongly pressed us to not make that offer, as you wish to revive your clan in the future. As an honorary member, we expect and demand nothing from you. Why? Because we would not offer if you were not worthy of kinship, even informally. Sasuke thought a moment more, then blushed slightly when he realized he had another important, if uncomfortable, question. This will not impact my reproductive capabilities? Shibi shook his head, and Sasuke thought he saw the man smother a small smile. No, he said, the Kakashi will avoid the relevant areas of your body. Socially, there may be consequences. Outsiders often look down on us as abnormal. We cannot promise your mating options will not decline because of this. But you will remain biologically capable. Should you be unable to find a mate, the Aburame would be willing to find a compatible one from amongst our ranks, to ensure that goal is met. Shino must have seen Sasuke's face, because he was quick to comment. We Aburame do not see the world as you do. For us, the social protocols of love are largely stripped away for the practicalities of raising our young in a healthy and effective manner. His face softened slightly. We are not inhuman. We have emotions. Many of our people find love in our own way, and should we need to find you a mate, feel assured she will not be unwilling in the matter. But for us, emotions are born in logic, not in spite of it. She would love you because you were her husband and the eventual father of her children, rather than something so shallow as appearance or reputation. Shino smiled slightly. In school, out of all your fellow classmates, I may have been one of the few who truly appreciated how you suffered at the hands of your fangirls, although I will not pretend I did not find it amusing as well. Sasuke closed his eyes and considered his choices. He had been presented with a rare honor, that he knew, but he pushed that little bit of pride away. He was slightly disturbed by the idea of a living hive within him as well, and that was much harder to push away, but he did so. He looked at the cold logic, cost and benefit, but in the end, his fear and pride kept pushing in, distracting him from what he needed to think. He could not put aside his emotions like Shino. Of course, I know exactly where to get an impartial and logical opinion. Shino, he said, his eyes still closed, you know of my long-term goals. What is your recommendation? Shino needed very little time to think. If you take the hive, he said, you gain some unique capabilities, ones your foes may not expect. If the hive works out, you benefit. If the hive does not work out, all you have lost is the chakra you fed them during the initial stages and some slight scarring where your pathway exits were located, neither of which would be detrimental to your goals. You have little concern about the social stigma of having a hive, and neither of your teammates seem to fear me, so they should react with a neutral or possibly favorable tone. I am of the opinion that you lose nothing to take the hive, and stand to gain if it works. Sasuke smiled in the dark. Such a Shino answer. I agree, and consent to receive a hive and training amongst your clan. As Sakura neared Dan's shop, she saw the older man standing on a small stool, placing large wooden shutters over his window. The bench he usually kept outside already missing. As she approached, Sakura peeked through one of the still open windows and saw that his shelves were empty of perishables, the coolers clean and powered down. Dan? She asked apprehensively, what happened to the shop? Everything okay? Dan turned at her and gave her a broad smile. When he turned, she could see that under his normal apron and work pants, he was wearing a lightweight and loose workout suit instead of his usual civilian attire. Things are wonderful. He stepped down from the stool and swept Sakura into a surprisingly solid hug. I saw the tape already. Kakashi made sure a copy floated my way. He hurriedly set the last of the shutters over his window, then waved Sakura into the shop. Once inside, Dan dragged over the bench, as well as a small plastic cooler. He opened it and pulled out a few cuts of meat for Kiri, as well as a Western-style sandwich for himself and Sakura. Sakura accepted the meal eagerly, her first real meal since the exams started, and the three of them spent several minutes in companionable silence as they ate. Dan finished first, then excused himself and wandered into the back. By the time Sakura finished, Dan was walking back into the room with a large backpack held in his arms. I have a gift for you, he said, holding out the pack. The pack was an ancient thing made of leather, poorly cared for and cracking wherever it wasn't rotting. Instead of the design Sakura was used to, with an opening on the top, the entire back of it was laced up around its contents. It was also large, nearly the size of Sakura's torso, and just as thick. She set the awkward bag on the floor and pried the old leather ties loose, eventually resorting to cutting a few of them. She unwrapped the leather to reveal a large scroll that filled nearly the entire bag, as well as a small leather pouch like the one she carried on her hip. Dan's smile dulled a little when she looked up at him, and he waved at the scroll. She unrolled it slightly on the floor. On the very edge of the scroll, written in an archaic script, could be seen the words, "Only those who ask with sincerity may gain our aid. Only those who serve with sincerity may earn our trust." After that was a series of thin vertical boxes. The first 7 were filled with writing in a form Sakura did not recognize, followed by a series of handprints in blood. The 8th was the same, except this box was legible. Written within it was the name, Fukui Daniel, and another set of prints, this set smeared from the tips all the way down to the near end of the scroll. Every square afterwards was blank. Dan kneeled in front of the scroll with a tired grunt, the first time Sakura had ever seen him sit without a chair, and he touched the scroll with reverence. I came from a distant land across the great ocean to the east when I was a mere child. My parents did not survive the crossing, and I was discarded by the crew when the ship arrived at port. I survived a meager existence on scraps and garbage. Begging was useless, my foreign nature was not appreciated in that town. It was a dirty and desperate way to live, but I still found one shining reason to keep moving each day, and that was my friend, Miro Nico. Miro was an ally cat like me, and when we first met, I'll admit, I tried to catch and eat him. He evaded me for a full day, dragging me across the town and back again, and every time I thought I had him cornered, he escaped again. Eventually, I gave up and sat in the dirt to try and drown the rumbling of my stomach with a good cry. But Miro came back, and brought with him a loaf of bread, pilfered so skillfully from a baker that I half suspect they never found out. Dan let out a happy sigh. Those became golden days for me. Miro helped me get food, find shelter, watched over me in my sleep to ensure my safety. I did the same for him, and in the process, learned about stealth and secrecy, how to spot foes before they spotted me, and how to lash out wildly when cornered, until none would try to harm me anymore. Sakura waited, but Dan had gone quiet, head down, and although his lips moved, no sound was being made. Dan? Are you okay? She asked. When he didn't react, she laid a hand gently on his arm. Dan lifted his head again, and unshed tears brightened his eyes. Sorry, he said, his smile growing again. I often miss those days, wild and free and irresponsible. But like all things, they'd had to end. His smile shrunk slightly, but did not fade completely. Miro was an old cat by the time I met him. In the few years I was with him, he went from an athletic if aging cat to an ancient and thin creature. Eventually, he grew tired and sickly. It took me a full day to find him, curled up in a hidey hole he'd never shown me, an old and closed-off sewer. I guess he was too tired to leave the place. When I found him, he dragged himself up and wobbled over to one corner of the old sewer. I followed him, and saw him pawing weakly at this scroll, propped against the wall. I picked it up, opened it, saw what had been done with it. I asked him if I should do as they had, sign my name and make my mark. Miro grunted, and I did so. The moment I made the last fingerprint, Miro let out a single purr, just the lightest little sound, and quietly died. Sakura rubbed her eyes as Dan started to cry quietly. Eventually, Kiri wandered over and curled up next to Dan, purring quietly. That seemed to break his sorrow a little, and he ran a hand gently along the cat's back. I came from a land without knowledge of shinobi or summoning contracts. I didn't even know what chakra was. Thankfully, the Nico summoning contract is different from others of the sort. When someone new signs it, one of their kind is notified, and if no contact is forthcoming, they use a reverse summoning to discover what has happened. They were not pleased on my arrival. He laughed, and a bit of his previous good cheer returned to his voice. Miro had been tasked with finding a new summoner when the old one died, but he was not exactly a conformist. He wasn't happy with any of the shinobi he met, and eventually gravitated to the civilian town where he found me. They trained me for more than 10 years, and I still hate every single day of it. His smile was warm even as he said that, and Sakura suspected he enjoyed it more than he let on, like an old war veteran who told warm stories about friends who had died. So why are you not a shinobi, Dan? Dan shook his head and waved his arms down at himself. I am what I am. When not literally starving, I tend to be slightly overweight and doughy. Not to mention slow. And lazy. Sakura giggled slightly at his honest appraisal, and he laughed in return. I'm not shinobi material, and frankly, the lifestyle scares me. I didn't think I'd handle life and death situations all that well, and after 10 years, the elders of the Niniko agreed fully. So instead, they sent me out to one of the largest shinobi villages in the world to find a new summoner. Dan reached out and nudged the scroll closer to Sakura, who frowned. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked with a frown on her face. Hell, how will they feel about Kiri? Would they be angry I already have an ally? Kiri looked up at Dan with possibly the smuggest face a cat could have, which is impressive, because almost all cats are very good at that face. She then clawed Dan on the leg, making him jump up and curse. All right, he shouted, I'm getting there. He turned to Sakura and pointed at Kiri. Where do you think Kiri came from? An oddly intelligent kitten who just happens to show up one day in the Inuzuka compound? Long odds on that. I actually figured one of them would go for it, but you took on the responsibility to train her, and even if you did fumble along a bit, you turned out alright in the end. Sakura looked at Kiri, who gave a surprisingly human nod. She then gave a short bow to Kiri and rose with a smile. I am honored. I will gladly sign the Nico summoning contract. Dan handed her a pen, and she wrote her full name in the next square down the row. She then pulled out a kunai, nicked one of her fingers, and used the blood to press each print to the paper. She finished, and Dan smiled at her. I'll make sure Kiri remembers to summon you in a month, he said cheerfully, giving her a wave. Sakura was about to ask what he meant when the reverse summon technique hit and she vanished with a puff of smoke. Lee punched the training log with full force, each blow making the solid wood target shudder. Guy was right there with him, matching blow for blow, occasionally bellowing out some advice or encouragement. Niji was busy with his clan, formalizing his role as Hinata's teacher, as well as receiving training from Hayashi-sama. When they left the preliminary, Niji had seemed off, unusual, but not in a bad way. He didn't scowl when Lee congratulated him again for reaching the finals, nor did he talk about his fate, or Lee's fate as a loser, which was abnormal enough that Lee and Tenten had looked at each other and fallen silent. They had walked together a little way, and when it came time to part ways, Niji had said goodbye, but he also gave them a small smile, a tiny little uptick of the lips that had Lee burning with youth, and Tenten too, considering how red her face got. And Niji had promised Lee a spar later, after he got settled with everything that had happened. Win or lose, it is truly a wonderful day to be alive, because my rival had acknowledged him, and now, I must train that much harder to ensure I am a worthy foe. Lee laughed as he began to move faster, forcing Guy to speed up as well to keep the rhythm. Guy laughed as well. Tenten had not joined them in their training. Guy had roped in another jonin, a man named Ebisu, to train Tenten. Lee had been worried at first when he saw Ebisu-san's cold face, and after the trainer left with Tenten, Lee had asked Guy about it. Lee, said Guy, his face serious. We burn with the fires of youth. It is in our nature. But not all men and women are the same in that matter. Some must burn, but some must be cold and critical, serious, dour. It is no shame for them to be so, should such a mood serve to keep them motivated, and Ebisu is one such man. He is an elite trainer, a master of many of the core techniques we shinobi often use, and a natural choice for Tenten now that she is branching out slightly from her focus on weapons. Trust in me, Lee, and trust in him. Tenten will show the world her own youth soon enough. It said much about Lee that those mere words were enough to change his mind, to allow him to respect Ebisu-sama to train Tenten well. And as he continued to strike the post, his mind turned to Niji, and he began to wonder what motivated his eternal rival. Lee heard someone approaching him from behind, slowly and hesitantly, and stopped his exercise to turn and greet whoever it was. What he saw was a blonde girl around Sakura's age, dressed in a simple dark blue jumpsuit, bowing deeply on the ground. Her hair was carefully pinned up in a tight bun behind her head, arranged to be difficult to move, and her ears had clearly once had piercings, now removed. The girl raised her head, and Lee realized he recognized her. "Yamanaka-san?" he asked. She nodded carefully, then flinched when Lee cheered and rushed over to pick her up off the ground. "Yamanaka-san, I wanted to congratulate you on your youthful fight. I was quite impressed that you defeated such a worthy and dangerous foe." Guy laid a hand on her shoulder, and when she looked up at him, his smile was gentle and friendly. "I was more impressed with your words after your fight, as I know Hokage-sama was. It was a good decision to make, and a credit to your serious intent." He waved the two of them over to a tree, where the two of them had laid their packs. He pulled out 3 canteens of water and handed one to each of the genin before taking a deep draught for himself. "I have a guess why you are here, Yamanaka-san, but please, speak freely. We are not complicated people, Lee and I, and value honest and direct statements over elaborate wordplay." Lee nodded, his face so serious and earnest that it brought a smile to Ino's own lips. "I want you to train me," she said, looking squarely at Lee. Sakura suggested it after the forest. She suggested that from what she had seen, and from what she had heard from Naruto, you are a genius of hard work, and I think that's what I need. She sighed, but managed to keep smiling. "Hard work is not my family's way. Because of our clan's techniques, we tend to end up in torture and interrogation, and I doubt I will be any different. As such, we rarely focus on abilities outside of our clan's specialty. But I want to be a capable kunoichi, and right now I am not. I need work, hard work, and you're the one to provide it." "Of course," said Lee cheerfully, "I am sure Guy-sensei will be glad to help you." Guy coughed in his fist and smiled. "She was talking to you, Lee." Lee looked at his sensei, confused, then shook his head and looked at Ino as if she were mad. "I am not a teacher. I am a mere student. It would be better for all if Yamanaka-san were to train under you, Guy-sensei." It was Ino who denied that claim. "Lee, I am not anywhere near the same level as you two are. In order to train me, Guy-sama would have to reduce your own training to a very small level indeed. But you could easily give me guidance, having come from a position of weakness and made it into strength, and while I may never catch up to your level, I would still want to try. Further, with such low-key training compared to what you usually do, it could easily be used as a cool-down period for your own training without disrupting your own growth." Guy nodded along to Ino's reasoning. He had been worried about that himself, and while he knew Lee to be a kind-hearted boy and would gladly make the sacrifice of time and training to help this young lady, it would curtail his own efforts, and he would soon have grown bored with the level of training that such a physically weak person would need. "Lee, I think you should accept," said Guy, in his most serious tone and face. "It will give you a chance to learn how to teach, from a willing and receptive ally." He rested his hands on Lee's shoulders, and for a moment, marveled at how the boy had grown over the years, how tall and strong he was. It brought a manly tear to his eye. "I will not be a teacher forever, Lee, and when that day comes, you will need to pass what you know to some other young person with the fires of youth. Now is a good chance to train yourself to be a teacher as well as a fighter." Lee looked thoughtful for a moment, his eyes narrowing in thought. But he nodded, his eyes starting to gleam with inner fire, and turned to Ino. "Woasich!" he shouted, causing Ino to flinch slightly at the volume. "I shall train you to be a genius of hard work, like myself and Guy-sensei. And if I cannot..." He paused. What challenge could ever top that, the failure of being unable to teach? Nothing could compare. And if I cannot, he continued, I will do so anyhow. I will continue to teach you, until our very deaths. One way or another, you will become strong like us. He turned to his sensei, his eyes gleaming with determination, then to Ino, who looked hopeful at his declaration, and gave them both a number 34 nice guy pose with thumbs up and extra tooth sparkle with a hand-painted background. I will never stop trying. That is my shinobi code. Lee, I am so proud of you. Guy swept Lee into a manly hug. Guy-sensei. Lee, Guy-sensei. Lee, there was a pause. Then Lee turned to Ino, with unshed manly tears in his eyes. Ino-san. He shouted, with just as much enthusiasm, his arms open. Ino began to sigh in mild distaste, then stopped herself. Old Ino valued appearances, even when there was nobody to judge. Old Ino also failed completely as a kunoichi. Maybe new Ino should give it a try. Ah, what the hell, she finally said, it works for you too. Lee. And she permitted what she soon realized was not some delicate, potentially romantic hug, but a rib-crushing, back-aching mauling. It was not a mere hug, it was a test of strength, as she would soon discover all things were when Lee and Guy had the power of youth coursing through them. Ino-san. Lee, she gasped weakly, trying to breath. Ino-san. Lee, she barely whispered, as her vision started to fade. Ino-san. Chapter 32, The Lessons We Learned Today. Sasuke. The moment Sasuke had agreed to receive a hive, they had pulled out paperwork. Reams of it. He signed requisitions for Kakashi care books, early hive growth materials, a detailed and nearly unreadable paper that categorized the particular strain of Kakashi he was to receive and all of its traits, and a lot of legal forms that essentially said, over a span for 20 pages, that he did not hold the Aburame clan responsible for accidents or problems, and that the Kakashi he would receive would become his legal property. Having signed all the forms, Shibi and Shino had escorted him past the airlock he had seen previously, a long series of doors designed to seal to the point of being airtight. In each room, a light of a different color lit the area, from blue to green to violet, and the floor had vibrated. Shino explained that the airlocks were designed to trigger different effects from different breeds of Kakashi, allowing visitors to discern if they had any stowaways. Sasuke noticed Shibi and Shino let out very small and very similar sighs at the end of the third room. When the older man noticed he was being watched, he gave a small smile. Agitating Kakashi is uncomfortable for us, akin to an itch you cannot scratch. I always disliked this procedure, but follow it anyhow. It is important. Remember that, should you come here again. Sasuke nodded, remembering the talk of contamination from earlier. From there, they had lead him into a shockingly bright hallway, painted solid white and lit with long tube lights on the ceiling. The hallway was long, straight, and carved into a squared-off and even shape, making it stand out after the warren that was the Aburame residential area. At the end of the hall was a small room containing baggy white one-piece suits along the walls and a second airlock, this one guarded by an Aburame with the same sort of suit on. Each suit had tight-fitting closures on the arms, legs, and neck, as well as a strange, tubular hat that strapped from forehead to the nape of the neck and held back Sasuke's hair. We take potential cross-contamination seriously, said Shibi as he and Shino stepped into their suits and began to seal them. This keeps our hives from leaving, and keeps other Kakashi from trying to hide within us. Remember that, should you come here again. From there, they entered yet another set of airlocks, same as the first, but beyond them was a much dimmer example of the previous hallway, this one sloping downward in a gentle spiral. It was still a brilliant white and still carved smooth and straight, but the lighting was more subdued. It is designed this way, explained Shino, to give insects no opportunity to hide. All who pass through here are to watch carefully and report any insect they see in this room that is not their own, and expected to keep their hives fully within them. Remember that, should you come here again. They walked for several minutes, slowly spiraling downward. They passed many metal doors, each one labeled with an elaborate numbering system. They also passed several Aburame as they did so, most of them pushing carts laden with bottles and glass containers. Each nodded politely to all three as they passed, and they all returned the acknowledgement. These people, said Shibi quietly, are the caretakers. They feed those hives that are not implanted, keeping a safe breeding stock for future hives. They have no hive of their own, only the pathways, and instead go from hive to hive. To not have their own hive is an unpleasant thing, and yet they all are volunteers for the work. Be respectful of them, they can help you if you have questions. Remember that, should I come here again? Sasuke asked, with a small smile. Shibi nodded, deadly serious, but from the corner of his eye, Sasuke saw Shino look away and smirk just slightly. Eventually, Shibi stopped in front of a door. This door was marked differently from the others, saying XXEXP instead of following the number system. The door opened to reveal a room that was much darker than the hallway had been, shrouding the room beyond an impenetrable gloom. Sasuke heard the click of his host's glasses being put away over the background sound of humming insects, and resolved then and there to get a pair for future visits. It took several minutes for his eyes to adjust well enough to see the room and its contents, during which time Shibi and Shino remained at his side, silently waiting. Once he was able to see, he realized that this room was lined on either side with hundreds of small, clear boxes, each one with a label. He leaned in to look closer and saw that each box had an elaborate code printed carefully on it, and each one contained a single insect of some sort. Some were obviously damaged, like the one with an extra set of wings that interfered with the original set, leaving the entire misshapen insect nothing to do but crawl around the box, dragging its wings forlornly. Others looked identical to what Sasuke was used to seeing from Shino, but each was held separate and labeled differently. At the very end of the room was a large glass door, beyond which Sasuke could see a lone man leaning over a desk with an upper section made of glass and a lower section of stone. On either side of the desk, Sasuke could see a clear box, slightly larger than the ones in the room, and inside the desk, he saw two Kakashi flying leisurely in circles. Shibi walked over and tapped on the glass door, causing the man to look up at them. He wore his hair much like Shino did, a disorganized and ragged cut, but the man's hair was much longer, resulting in what could only be called a mess of hair surrounding his head, all white with age. His fluffy beard and goatee, combined with that hair, resulted in a look that could only be described as surprised cotton ball. The man was obviously an elder, his face lined with the onset of old age, and he raised himself from his stooped position slowly. But most shocking of all, when the man saw Sasuke, he smiled. Not some small, barely noticed uptick of the lips, but a genuine smile, one that could rival Naruto's in jovial grandeur. "Ah, Shibi, Shino," he said cheerfully, "I see you have brought the young man you spoke so well of finally." The old man looked at his desk for a moment, checking that it was sealed properly, then made his way to the glass doors and opened them, waving the three of them inside. Come in, let's have a look." He eyed Sasuke from toes to crown, and his smile only grew larger. A healthy young man, in good condition. An excellent subject. He stuck out a hand. "I am Aburame Tobokanshu, and it is a pleasure to meet you, Uchiha. Please, call me Tobo." Sasuke shook the man's hand hesitantly, and Tobo started to laugh. "Yes," he said, "I know, strange for a Aburame to be so expressive, right?" He shot a grin at Shibi, whose face did not change. "I spent a lot of time outside the hive in my youth, unlike my distant nephew here, and it rubbed off on me." He chuckled and wandered over to his desk. He pressed a hand to the glass, shutting his eyes and humming to himself until the insects within went into their individual boxes, which closed around them. Once they had shut, Tobo pulled each box and carried them back into the storage room outside, sliding them into place. He then moved along the left wall until he was some distance away and leaned in to squint at the number on the box before him. He nodded to himself, pulled the box, and walked quickly back into the room. "I see you're slated for XX-109A, the end product of my life's work, the Kakashi Enhancement Program." He hummed merrily to himself as he reached below the glass portion of the table, pulling up a clipboard bulging with paper, which he started to thumb through. "I have been working on this for some time," he continued, flipping page after page. "It took more than 1,500 generations before I finally got it right, you know. I still don't know why the one breed keeps ending up with additional wings, or the ones that started eating flesh instead of chakra, but I managed to weed those inconsistencies out after another 20 or so generations." He looked up from the paper, and seeing Sasuke sitting calmly, frowned. "You're not worried about these insects eating you in your sleep?" Sasuke shook his head. "I trust Shibi-sama and Shino, and they have given me a reasonable explanation of the risks involved. As they did not mention my flesh being consumed in my sleep, I am assuming either you're deliberately trying to rile me up and scare me away, or else you were successful in your breeding efforts." "Damn," replied Tobo, his smile returning to his face. You already talk like one of us. Excellent. He stepped around the desk and looked Sasuke in the eye, his face serious. Uchiha-kun, I am very glad for this, but listen. The process will hurt a great deal, and the more you encourage them, the faster they'll expand and the more it will hurt. It will feel like they are eating you alive. This is not what is happening, but it will feel exactly as you would expect. Do not swat at your skin. Do not poke at the holes. Do not push them any harder than you can handle. And when in doubt, withdraw your chakra from the queen's location, and they will stop expanding. Got it? Sasuke nodded, and Tobo clapped his hands and practically pranced back around the desk. He reached down and dug into the stone portion of the desk, eventually pulling up a small bottle with a thick needle attached. He hummed to himself, opening the bottle, then the box containing the queen. He held out a finger, and the queen flew over and landed on it. Tobo smiled at it as if it was his own child, then raised his hand toward Sasuke for inspection. Sasuke was rather surprised. The queen was twice as large as a normal Kakashi, with a longer abdomen and a thicker shell that closed over its wings. Also, unlike normal Kakashi, the queen shimmered with iridescence, the color of her carapace shifting from green to blue to purple depending on how the light hit it. For a mere insect, he thought as he watched it shimmer and dance on Tobo's fingers, she is beautiful. She rotated on her perch on Tobo's hand and wiggled the two feelers on her head at Sasuke, and Sasuke found himself fighting an urge to return the greeting with his fingers. Go on, said Tobo, still smiling, say hello, Uchiha-kun. Sasuke raised his two fingers and imitated the movement she had made as well as he could. The queen buzzed for a moment, her shell lifting to reveal a double pair of translucent wings, then took off, flying around Sasuke's head several times before landing on his shoulder, where he could feel her thrumming at him. Kakashi are not sentient, said Shibi, his lips slightly upturned. They have no sense of self beyond the overall health of the hive, and no language that can be directly translated by us. But they do have some degree of intelligence, just like any other companion. They will speak to you in code, with the sound of their wings and the tap of their feet and the wiggle of their limbs. This code I will help you learn, but much of it will be learned by you and her together. Your code is singular, as is your hive. And they do seem to appreciate a good host. Tobo laughed and clapped his hands again, and Shibi's face returned to its normal stoic blankness. Ah, I love when one of my people actually admits to enjoying life in a manner others understand, he said cheerfully. I always appreciate the effort involved. He walked over to Sasuke and held the bottle out, allowing the queen to back into it before snapping the needle shut. Uchiha-kun, he said, please focus your chakra wherever it is you intend to keep your queen. Do not tell me where it is, nor anyone else. Should the queen die, your hive will become unstable and unhelpful until a new queen can be transformed from a drone, which takes days. She is your link to it and thus, a weakness. Sasuke thought for a moment, then focused his chakra to his left shoulder, just below his shoulder blade. Then Shibi gave a slight cough, and Sasuke turned to look at him, only to feel a sudden and painful stabbing sensation on his back. Before he could flinch away, the needle was out, and Tobo was already returning to his desk. The queen is now sensing where you want her to nest. However, the sensation of her reaching that point is unpleasant. Thankfully the species began its evolution into a shinobi ally as a parasite, so she will instinctively wait until you sleep to make the initial transition. When you wake up tomorrow she will be ready to begin, her eggs already hatched into drones. The new drones will start to make your pathways, just under your skin. It will hurt as they make the pathway, but once they have made it, the pain will cease. The area will be tender, but that will fade quickly. Meanwhile, he smiled in a manner that looked almost manic, and reached down into the desk again. I have some forms for you to sign. Sasuke woke up the next day with his back slightly sore in a line that ran from his injection point to his left shoulder. He could feel the occasional tap of the queen's legs under his skin, and while the sensation was strange, knowing what it was not nearly as unpleasant as he had expected. Or maybe Shino just prepared me well enough. He got up and made his way to the kitchen, pouring himself a small glass of water. To that, he added a spoonful of what Tobakanshu insisted on calling royal jelly, even after Shibi had pointed out it was actually a powder. The diluted medicine was disgusting, cloyingly sweet and bitter at the same time, but Sasuke choked it down without complaint. This will loosen your skin slightly, Shibi had said as he was explaining the things Sasuke was receiving for his early hive care. It also has a mild numbing agent. Both of these will make it easier on you and your hive as they start to spread. Take it each morning and each night. With nothing better to do, Sasuke cleaned up his futon and sat at his kitchen table, an interesting book on the differences between poisons and venoms waiting for him, as was his breakfast. He then took a deep breath and focused his chakra on the location he had chosen for the queen, willing her to begin. Let's see how bad this will be. The effect was immediate. A searing pain started in his shoulder, a sensation akin to a knife being dragged through his skin, and Sasuke hissed in surprise at how sharp it felt. He retracted his chakra, and the pain stopped. Shit, he thought, taking a deep breath. They were serious when they said it would hurt. He stilled his beating heart, then focused even more chakra at the queen. The pain increased dramatically, and Sasuke had to stop after a minute, the pain having moved only a quarter inch at best. Sasuke grit his teeth, knowing that he was in for a lot of suffering, and decided he was more inclined to try and go for a walk to hopefully distract himself. He knew for certain that the book would not hold his attention under such an onslaught. Kakashi spotted Sasuke from the tavern, where he was discussing with Enko how he should spend his winnings of the bets he had already won. She was laughing uproariously at his retelling of his confrontation with Yasuike about the wording of their bet, and as she did so, he happened to glance out the window and saw Sasuke passing by, his posture slumped and his teeth grit. He excused himself quickly, getting a miffed snort from his companion, and dashed out to catch the boy. Yo, my cute stewed. Are you okay, Sasuke? Kakashi did not ask that question on a whim. Sasuke looked terrible, covered in sweat and panting slightly, his skin slightly pale and his eyes somewhat bloodshot. It looked like his little genin was having a heart attack, and while that was highly unlikely, Kakashi was not a medic. He was ready to grab Sasuke and dash for the hospital when the boy managed to grunt at him. Hive, Sasuke managed to mumble through his clenched teeth. Kakashi winced and nodded. Shibi had informed him ahead of time about the possibility that Sasuke would be working on growing a hive. He did not know much about the Aburame clan or how their hives worked, but he knew that the insects could travel under their skin. He assumed they did so by making tunnels within the boy's body, which had to hurt tremendously. Is there anything I can do? He asked. Distract. Train. Kakashi thought for a moment, then asked, is it safe for you and them? He waved his hand vaguely, unsure how Sasuke might refer to the insects, but certain that most Aburame had a sore spot when it came to how others treated their companions. Collective. Them. Whatever. Quit. Bullshit. Kakashi gave a mental sigh, but he had to give it to the boy. Sasuke was willing to work hard to improve himself at least. And there was one thing I wanted to teach him before the finals. Kakashi out his arm gently around Sasuke's shoulders and started steering him to one of the more distant training grounds. Well, there is one move I wanted to give you, to pass down as it were. Sakura. Sakura grunted and swung as hard as she could at the ice-covered rock. The pick in her hand bit deep, and after a quick test to see if it would hold her weight, she pulled herself another arm's length up the mountain, fighting to ignore the burning sensation in her arms as she did so. The wind chose that moment to blow, sending snow and ice into her hood and down the back of her neck. What a delightful spring breeze, said her companion for this journey, an ancient and patch-coated cat named Anna who had slung herself across Sakura's shoulders at the start of the journey, and who was apparently quite snug under the girl's borrowed jacket. Sakura bit back her aggravation. Her arrival at the home of the Niniko, an ancient and somewhat run-down castle, had been unexpected by the cats, but after the initial surprise, they quickly adjusted and went back to their usual feline behavior, which mostly consisted of ignoring her. Sakura had expected some sort of test, so she had waited quietly for them to speak to her. She spent her time wandering the castle, looking out the window, and practicing her forms in what had once been a walled-off garden, now overgrown and wild. The cats ignored her, so she ignored them right back. After all, they were cats. Eventually a minor Niniko, barely more than a kitten, had approached her and requested that she help her grandmother get back home. Sakura had jumped at the chance to make a connection with the Niniko, no matter how small, and had graciously accepted. That's when she learned two things, unfortunately. The first was, spry as the elder cat was, she was completely disinclined to walk or otherwise convey herself, instead choosing to ride Sakura like a horse. The second was that she lived alone on top of the highest mountain in the region. These things were apparently not a surprise to Anna, who had been saving human-sized equipment for that very occasion, and had been quite friendly when she offered to let Sakura use them for free. Sakura had been angry at first and almost refused to use them, but the old cat had insisted, and by then Sakura had no desire to argue. Now, hanging onto the sheer side of the mountain by the purchase granted to her by 2 ice picks and all of the friction she could get out of her contact with the mountain, Sakura was glad she had agreed. Initially, she had planned on scaling the mountain like any other obstacle, using her chakra to stick to it, but the moment she began to channel it, Anna had freaked out and started clawing her mercilessly. Apparently, Anna was both old and sensitive to chakra. "It makes my bones ache," she had said as Sakura had cleaned and bandaged her cuts, and an old girl certainly has enough aches in her life. And oh, how she hurt. All shinobi use chakra to increase their strength, agility, and endurance in a passive manner. The human body alone could not do half the things considered normal by their standards. For a shinobi, leaping 20 feet to go from tree branch to tree branch faster than a civilian could run was a genin standard. What she had been doing for the past day had been grueling. No chakra to increase her endurance. No chakra to reduce her fatigue. No chakra to make the ordeal faster. Sakura, used to moving meters at a time, was reduced to a single grueling arm's length, one at a time. Her arms burned and trembled with exhaustion, so much so that she had tied her picks to her arm in case she lost her grip. She was tired, more than tired, weary to the bone, as a body used to fueling itself through chakra instead fueled itself through nothing more than her meager breakfast the day before and her own stubborn, cussed willpower. With another grunt, Sakura lifted her other arm and smashed the pick into the ice. She had been astounded when they had arrived at the mountain. No mountain should consist almost entirely of flat vertical surfaces, but that was certainly all she could see when she looked at the towering cliffs. In the end, she had no choice but to drag herself up, one grueling arm's length at a time, to the unending sound of blowing wind, crackling ice, and an old cat loudly commenting on how warm and comfortable she was. Sakura pulled herself up, then swung her pick again, only to meet nothing but air. She managed a glance upward and realized she had reached the top, and after a few moments she pulled herself up on the edge and rolled over, panting in the snow. There was a shuffling sound in her coat, and Anna peeked out of her hood. "Ah," said the ancient cat with a tired yawn with her old and creaky voice. "It seems we're here." Sakura rolled over and looked at their destination, her mood darkening. She had expected something grand, an old temple or fortification, or even just a pleasant and fanciful wooden building. What she found, however, was a shack. A large shack, to be sure, and once a grand place, built along the lines of a dojo, but now, just a shack. A gust of wind howled across the top of the mountain and caused the shack to shudder as if ready to collapse. "Well, come on, lazy," said Anna, snuggling back under Sakura's hood, up and at it. "We'll get you some tea before you climb back down." Sakura bit back a sharp reply and pulled herself to her feet, then trudged to the nearest door and slid it aside. The room inside was dark and dusty, with warped hardwood floors and faded tapestries. She followed Anna's instructions to the kitchen, a tiny wood-burning stove tucked into an old closet space, with a single chipped ceramic cup and a tin kettle and several crates stuffed with preserved food, mostly cat food. Sakura went through the motions, setting water to boil and setting out the one cup she could find, while Anna finally left her shoulders and curled up in the corner nearest to the stove. After a few minutes, the old cat began to purr. "It's good to be home," she said quietly, curling herself into a tight ball. "This may be a rundown old place, but home is about what you are happy with, I think. And you?" The old cat opened one eye, watching Sakura search around the tiny closet after realizing there was no tea. When the girl made no reply, Anna stretched out slightly. "Of course, who am I to speak, I suppose? I settled for this place, far less than I was due. Maybe it's for the young to dream of something more." Sakura nodded robotically, but then stopped when she considered the cat's words. After a moment, she asked, "What was due to you?" Anna let out a short purr and sat up, her tail curling around her legs, her long whiskers spreading out from her face. "Anna is not my name, although I answer to it," she said, and her voice suddenly had a lot less gravel in it. "It's part of my title, Kurayami no Anna, Lady of the Darkness, and it is one I earned well. Back when that layabout Dan was here, I was head of the Niniko clan." When she saw Sakura perk up slightly at this, she gave the human a feline grin and flicked her tail a few times. "I was the one who defended our home from invaders. I watched our land, and when someone approached with ill intent, I would wait until nightfall before I visited them. There was no mercy offered, because none was expected, and nobody earned my ire unless they were a direct threat to me and mine. She grunted and lay back down. But old age gets us all, girl, and you best remember that. I spent so much time worrying about my people that I put no thought to myself. I made no effort, no preparation, and when I grew too old to do my duty and retired, I found that I had nothing left of my life. I had no real family, just distant relations I barely knew, like the kitten I roped into asking you to carry me. I had no home, having spent most of my life in my office or in the field. I was granted this place, the place where I once trained, because none other had need of it. And now, I think you'd better ask, because I know you are going to. Sakura got on her knees and bowed low to the ancient warrior before her. Will you train me, Kurayami no Ana? Ana laughed, a warm and happy chuckle that sounded out of place coming from an old cat. Just Ana will do. She stood from her corner and walked forward to twine herself through Sakura's legs. My girl, I have waited for many years for this chance. I trained Dan when I was much younger, and that lazy bastard never did anything with it. He is the most cat-like human I have ever met. She said this with warmth, as any teacher would speak of a student who for all their failure had none the less earned their teacher's love. Sakura smiled at that and nodded in agreement. We Naniko live a great deal longer than our natural cousins do, but even we grow old. I was greatly enthused when the notice went out that someone had arrived after signing the contract. But after the fiasco with Dan, none wanted the task of teaching a new summoner until they knew it was worth the effort. Their loss is my gain. I'd be happy to become famous for training a student such as yourself, even if it'll be a lot of work. Sakura grunted in irritation, but a smile managed to make its way through her aggravation and weariness in spite of herself. So, sensitive to chakra? How does that work for a Naniko? Ana laughed again. I had to test you somehow. I knew from the feel of you that you were a proper shinobi, and many of them would gladly pass on an unpaid charity mission when given such an unpleasant limitation as not using chakra. You did well. I had assumed at some point your body would give out and I'd have to save you. Ana stood and started to walk away. I have no tea, as you suspected, so we may as well start. Follow me. Sakura held out her flashlight and stared into the dark room. It was large, built into the center of the dojo out of thick iron plates. Inside she could see hundreds of small holes built into every wall. The walls were also covered in minute dents, some of them quite deep. Sakura had a rough idea what the box was used for, and was quite nervous about it. We call this Schrodinger's box, said Ana from her seat next to the door, the grin on her face matching the tone of her voice. You enter, and until the door opens again, nobody knows if you've survived. It is soundproofed and very, very solid, because yes, those holes are used to launch projectiles at frightening speeds at whoever is inside. It will probably not kill you, Sakura, at least, not unless I coil the springs a few times more than normal. Sakura gulped nervously. She was a shinobi, and was good at dodging ranged attacks, but with hundreds of potential attack angles at the same time, her reactions would be a great deal slower than normal. And when you enter, you may bring no light with you. Sakura whirled at the cat. I'm supposed to do this blind? Ana smiled, her eyes glowing in the dim shine from Sakura's flashlight, giving her a feral and wild appearance. You won't be, when I am done with you. Naruto. After the great Toad Sage had pulled himself from the floor after his close encounter with Iam's Mark V cast iron frymaster with luxurious wood handle, Jiraiya had laughed at himself and told Naruto he was there to train the boy. Naruto had nodded and agreed to meet the pervert in the park after lunch the next day, then left and immediately went to tell an adult, because something about the man hit all of the little buttons inside of him that said, here and now, you need an adult. Naruto asked Kakashi about Jiraiya, who regaled him with stories of his encounters with the world's greatest super pervert, giggling frequently and leaving suspicious gaps in the stories filled with nothing but more giggles and a promise to tell Naruto some other time. Jiraiya sounded like an awesome shinobi from those stories, even if he was a tremendous pervert. Naruto then asked Hokage Jiji, who told stories about the legend of Jiraiya the Sannin, Toad Sage, one of the three who so amused Hanzo of the Salamander with their skill in battle that he bestowed the title of Sannin upon them. When Naruto brought up Jiraiya's other apparent habits, Hokage Jiji had coughed into his fist and suggested that, aside from maybe that, nobody could be a better teacher for Naruto at this point than Jiraiya. And thus, Naruto found himself walking through the park, looked at every bush like it might contain his new sensei. Eventually, Naruto spotted the man sitting at a park bench, scribbling into a small notebook and giggling to himself. Naruto ducked into some nearby bushes and observed his sensei. Every time a male walked by, Jiraiya would look at him with a thoughtful and measuring look, jotting down some quick notes, and those men would often flinch away or glare at the famous pervert, although when Kakashi passed by, he asked Jiraiya to sign his book, something the man did with a cheerful grin. Every time a female walked by, however, Jiraiya became another man entirely. He would look at them with a faint sparkle in his eye and a leer on his face, giggling quietly and cheerfully, his pencil moving a mile a minute as he wrote several pages, his eyes never leaving the woman in question. Reactions were split in this case. Civilians would blush and turn away, or blush and glance shyly at the man. Kunoichi would blush and glare at him as if they could bring him to ignition temperature by that method. Eventually, once he saw the pattern, Naruto decided to get the drop on the distracted perverted sage, in the name of normal folk everywhere. He drew a fake explosive tag from his pouch and started to sneak forward silently the next time Jiraiya noticed a woman and started giggling. Naruto was good at stealth, having honed that skill well during his efforts to prank every citizen he could back in his youth, and every time Jiraiya stopped giggling, he froze, waiting for the next titter to mask his already quiet footsteps. Jiraiya never stopped his scribbles, even as Naruto rose up behind the bench, fake tag in hand and ready to slip into Jiraiya's headband. Then Jiraiya moved slightly, raising his book and looking at it as if it contained his next masterpiece. Naruto glanced up at the notepad and froze. Written in the middle of the pad, surrounded by pointless scribbles, was the words, "Put it down and come sit next to me, Naruto, you've been watching me long enough." Naruto's estimation of the pervert rose dramatically. It was not that Jiraiya had caught him. He was only a genin, and while he was good at stealth, he was not specialized in it. It was because Jiraiya never once broke character or acknowledged Naruto's presence, even as the pervert flashed his message to Naruto. Even as Naruto thought all of this, the act continued, and he watched as Jiraiya flipped a page and started scribbling madly as two women wandered by, blushing and giggling at him. The scribbles were meaningless nonsense, except for the words in the middle of the page, which said, "Come on, have a seat, it's time to learn from the great Jiraiya of the Sannin." Naruto sighed and took a seat next to the older man, who laughed quietly and gave him a pat on the back. "If it makes you feel better, that was a good job. Against many shinobi, I think you would have succeeded." Naruto grunted and rolled his eyes. "So, what are you going to teach me today, pervert?" Jiraiya smiled and slapped Naruto lightly in the back of the head. "Show some respect, kid. Call me Jiraiya, call me sensei, call me sage, anything. Just show some respect for the badass ninja who is going to teach you how to be badass too." Naruto grinned at the older man. "Fine, pervy sage, what are you going to teach me?" Jiraiya chuckled and accepted the title. It suited his purpose anyhow. "Tell me," he asked, leaning back and stretching himself over the park bench, "what was I doing while you were watching me?" He took a relaxed pose, arms dangling over the back of the bench, legs sprawled, as if he was a bachelor back in his pad with not a care in the world. "Writing smut," grumbled Naruto. Kakashi had explained exactly who Jiraiya was and why Naruto was not allowed to read the man's books until he was older. Watching his sensei squee like a fangirl and clutching his book to his chest was not a pleasant experience, and Naruto was still slightly put out from it. Jiraiya nodded cheerfully. He then glanced up the road and grinned. "Good, good. Watch what I write on this one." He pulled out his pad of paper and pencil, and his face went instantly from congenial old man to congenial old super pervert instantly. Naruto gulped when Kurenai appeared down the path and began walking towards them. Her red eyes drifted over and spotted Naruto, and she began to smile. Then Jiraiya giggled, and her eyes turned hard as they tracked over to the man scribbling in his notebook and staring at her. She stomped over and stopped in front of the pair, crossing her arms and stomping once again on the ground to draw attention. "What?" she asked Naruto, "are you doing with that thing?" Naruto was at a loss. He didn't want to be associated with Jiraiya. Well, okay, he wanted to be, but the Sannin part only, not the creepy pervert part. He nervously started to mumble something, then stopped in horror when he realized that Jiraiya was panting at her. "Why, hello, you wondrous beauty," Jiraiya said in his smoothest voice, his leer not falling even slightly. "And how stunning you look today, between your ruby lips, your alluring eyes, your incredible heaving tea." Kurenai let out a burst of killing intent, causing Naruto to back away as far as he could on the bench. Well, said Jiraiya, I can't do much with that personality quirk in my next book. Or maybe I can. The beautiful young store clerk, angry at every man who meets her, until one day, she finds a man manly enough to tame her angry heart. Jiraiya started scribbling again, his voice trailing off into a giggle. Kurenai snarled and threw up her hands, then turned to Naruto. Don't you dare pick up his habits, Uzumaki. Because if I catch you peeping like I caught this pervert last year, you will not be able to escape. She sent one last glare at Jiraiya, ineffective as it was with him paying her no mind any longer, then strode away, her posture stiff. The moment she got out of hearing range, Jiraiya stopped scribbling and turned to Naruto with his normal, somewhat friendly face. What did I write? He asked his student, holding up the notepad. Something perverted, I bet, came the reply. Jiraiya shook his head and handed Naruto the notepad, one particular page open to it. Naruto gave it a glance, then gave it a good look. A lot of it was scribbling, vaguely like writing, but so scrawling it was illegible. There were also some edit marks, several arrows and cross marks placed over the original nonsense. So, you wrote something perverted and then edited it? He asked, slightly confused. Jiraiya pointed out in front of him with a smirk. You see the Hokage tower over there? Hold the pad out next to it, as if you're shocked what is written, and then keep an eye on it. Look past the pad and at the tower. Naruto did what he was told, putting on the dumb and confused face he once gave the world when he was caught at a prank and started watching. At first, it made no sense. All he could see was a few shinobi guards along the roof, occasionally moving around slightly. Then, one of them jumped from one floor to the next, a routine procedure intended to catch infiltrators off guard. Another jumped a few moments later, this time horizontally, to take the place of the previous shinobi, and Naruto saw it. Naruto watched in awe as the shinobi across the way jumped in an exact formation, each maneuver matching the editing marks on the pad perfectly. After a few moments of study, Naruto began trying to predict the next move, and did so successfully. He turned to Jiraiya with the same dumbfounded look he had been wearing, and got a small nod from the older man. So now you know what I wrote. So tell me, why did nobody notice? Not Kakashi, not Kurenai, not one of the people who passed by, shinobi included. And yes, I knew who they are. And they knew who I am. So why? He took the pad back, pulled out his pencil, and started his act again when a male wandered by. The male noticed the scrutiny, paled, and turned away, his stride lengthening as he marched away as fast as he could. He flinched and turned away. They know you're a pervert, Naruto said, the words coming slowly as they pushed through the mental shock he felt at the realization that the dorky super pervert he was sitting next to was a badass. They know what you're writing is smut. You're famous for it. And because they are either embarrassed or a fan, nobody looks. Naruto slumped back into the bench, unconsciously mirroring the Sannin next to him, and a small smile started to creep across his face. That is an incredible prank. Jiraiya laughed and tucked his notepad away. That's right, Gaki. I am the legendary super pervert, Jiraiya of the Sannin, slayer of men, wooer of women, gigantic egomaniac, fabulous dancer, and famous author of the most depraved smut imaginable. What else could I possibly be writing? He stood up and reached behind his back, pulling out Naruto's frog wallet and tossing it to his flabbergasted student, who had never expected to see it again. When I swatted your hand, you flinched away from the movement, he explained. So I snagged it and chucked a rock through the roof along with a couple low-denomination bills. You watched the rock sail away, but you were certain it was your wallet, and that is what you believed until just now. Show someone what they expect, and they'll often stop paying attention to the details, and details kill in our world. Jiraiya spread his arms, raising them as if to encompass everything around him. This whole world is nothing but a giant stage, Gaki, and if you play your character right, people who pass you on the street will see the character, not you. I'm a legendary and dangerous fighter, but am infamously easy to fool and easy to distract with women. And every time someone tries to pull something on me, they bring an attractive woman with them, because not one is willing to consider that I'm better than that. I taught it to Minato, the fourth Hokage, who taught it to Kakashi, and now, if you like, I'll teach it to you. Teach me what? Asked Naruto, looking up at the man, rimmed by the sun like a halo, his hair glowing brilliantly. Jiraiya held out a hand. I'm going to teach you to be invisible. Naruto and Jiraiya were sitting at Ichiraka Ramen once more, this time with far less tension, mostly because Jiraiya had paid Tucci a great deal of money to repair his roof, and had apologized profusely to Ayam. Naruto was fairly certain his begging and pleading had helped the older man's case, but in the end, they allowed the Sannin to return, and even started to smile cheerfully as the two of them ate when they saw the two of them getting along. I see one problem with this whole invisibility thing, pervy sage, Naruto said around the noodles he was stuffing into his face. I've gotta get ready to kick some ass in the finals, and while your art of public invisibility is cool and all, nobody in the arena is going to be fooled. Jiraiya shook his head. Getting your foe to underestimate you is a powerful tool. Kakashi told me about your 101 Things jutsu. You would be amazed how many shinobi would be thrown off by that technique, simply because it's such a mind-bogglingly stupid technique to use in a fight. He shook a finger at the grinning blonde before he could speak up. Not that you should use it all that much. It would work well on a taijutsu or genjutsu type, but a ninjutsu type would simply blow them away, as would anyone with enough explosive tags or any number of possible bloodline traits. Use it sparingly, Gaki. Naruto nodded and ordered another bowl. Still, he said with a slight frown, I had hoped you'd have time to teach me a thing or two for more immediate use. It'd be great if I could go into the arena and kick ass with the new technique the incredible Jiraiya of the Sannin taught me. He gave a pleading look to the older man, eyes wide and gleaming, lip quivering slightly. Please, pervy sage, stop, Jiraiya said, pretending to shield his eyes. Not the begging face. Naruto turned it up a notch, giving a small sniff and pinching his hand hard enough for his eyes to tear. Please, Jiraiya-sensei, gah! Alright. I know you have your shadow clones, so I suppose we can have you use them to learn a few things while I teach you my most masterful art. There had been a thing or two I wanted to train you with anyhow. Naruto grinned cheerfully, beaming at Jiraiya as hard as he deliberately could, and Jiraiya laughed at the act. God, kid, you're just like your mother, you know. Naruto stopped the act and leaned forward quickly, upsetting his bowl as he grabbed the Sannin's red overcoat. Why, you knew my mother? Jiraiya looked at Naruto, and something seemed off about the man, like it had when they had first met. He looks happy and sad at the same time, thought Naruto as Jiraiya's face fell for a moment, then rose back into a grin. Yeah, I knew her, Jiraiya said, resting his elbows on the bar and leaning against it. I knew your dad, too. Naruto opened his mouth to ask, to demand to know, but he stopped before he could say anything. His first thought was, why did nobody tell me, if they knew? And then he asked himself why the Hokage would keep such a thing from him, and the answer slapped him in the metaphorical face. Because it's important not to tell me, just like the Kyuubi was, a dangerous secret. Naruto sat back and closed his mouth, licking his suddenly dry lips, and as much as it hurt, he knew what he had to say. I understand, he said, his voice shaking. If you can tell me anything, I'd appreciate it, but if not, I think I get why. Jiraiya gave Naruto a smile, not the cheerful half-grin he usually had, but a warm smile, much smaller than usual and yet that much more meaningful for it. The boy's emotions had been written clear on his face, as had his understanding. No. I'll tell you. But it would be best to go elsewhere before I do. You are correct in your assumption on why I know and you don't. After all, he told himself, there's no point being the mighty Jiraiya if I can't break the occasional rule. Naruto sat on the Hokage monument, watching the sunset with Jiraiya. He was sitting on the fourth Hokage's head. His dad's head. Naruto felt a little numb inside. He'd thought about who his parents were before, in his own little private fantasies, and thought about how he would react in those daydreams. Maybe his parents were awesome, and he'd jump about and celebrate. Or maybe they would be evil criminals, and he would cry and swear to return his family name to honor. He'd even considered the truth, in one of his more elaborate fantasies. He imagined himself cartwheeling in that one, but instead, he was numb. He'd felt that way the entire time, from the moment Jiraiya told him who his dad was, through the stories of his dad's training, and the explanation of the technique that was being passed down to him from his dad through his dad's old teacher. He knew who his dad was, and why he of all people had been chosen to hold the Kyuubi within him. He knew. Why don't I really care? He asked his dad's teacher. I should be excited and happy and laughing, but all I feel is sorta empty. Am I a bad person for this? Jiraiya shook his head and put an arm around the kid's shoulders. Nah, he said. It's just shock, kid. And when a person gets shocked like this, it takes time for them to adjust to it. Just relax, take your time, and don't force yourself to think about it. Eventually the numbness goes away, and you'll be back to the awesome spastic kid you already were before, only now you'll also know who your parents are. Naruto nodded mechanically. And I hate to say it, Jiraiya continued, but for now, this would be best left as a secret. Minato made quite a lot of enemies in the past, and the Hokage kept this secret to prevent those enemies from coming after you until you were ready to protect yourself. Naruto nodded again. It's not like he didn't already have one perception-shattering secret inside of him. What would it matter if he had a second? Naruto took a deep breath and released it, then turned to give Jiraiya a small smile. Thanks, Jiraiya-sensei. Jiraiya reached out and ruffled the kid's hair. Please, call me Pervy Sage. That's it for part 8. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.